A de facto alliance between the Austrian and Hungarian navies had existed for decades before the dual monarchy was officially formed. By the early 1860s, the joint navy was still reliant on ships built abroad. These included the French-built SMS Kaiser, which served as the navy's flagship. The fleet also included 3 mixed frigates, 2 sailing frigates, 2 mixed corvettes, 2 sailing sloops, 4 brigadoons, 13 paddle steamers, 12 gunboats, 7 schooners, and 4 floating batteries. It was the 7th largest navy in the world, not hugely impressive, but large nevertheless. Major ports for k.u.k. Kriegsmarine vessels included Trieste and Fiume in what is today Italy, and Cattaro, which is in Montenegro and named Kotor today. Its largest base was in Pola, which is today Pula in Croatia. The naval base at Pola was so large that the dual monarchy's entire fleet could be anchored in its main harbor at the same time. The k.u.k. Kriegsmarine's greatest victory would be the defeat of the larger Italian fleet at the Battle of Lissa, which took part in the Adriatic Sea just off the coast of Dalmatia. It would be the single biggest naval battle that took place in the 100 years between the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 and the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. After 1860, there were progressively more home-built vessels as well as the refurbishing of many existing vessels. The majority of warship projects came out of Stabilimento Tecnico Trieste, or STT, as well as smaller shipyards at Pola and Skoda Wiktowice, the latter being based in what is today the Czech Republic. Later, shipbuilding and refurbishing would also be done by Cantieri Navali Triestino, or CNT, based in the port of Monfalcone in the Venice region, which at that time was under Austrian rule. In the years leading up to World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire spent fairly little of its budget on the navy. In fact, by 1904, the navy accounted for just 15.7% of the empire's entire military budget. The Austrians badly wanted to expand the imperial navy during the latter part of the 19th century and into the 1900s, especially a status symbol for the empire, but there was stiff opposition from the Hungarians. Unsurprisingly, by 1914, the state of the k.u.k. Kriegsmarine fleet was very modest, even quite outdated by European imperial standards. Nearly all the fleet was composed of either old or obsolete stock, with the most recent warship having been built in 1903. A stocktake of the k.u.k. Kriegsmarine's fleet in 1914 was that it was composed of 15 battleships, which included 12 pre-dreadnoughts and 3 dreadnoughts, although some of these were added in 1915. The Navy also had 13 cruisers comprised of 3 armored cruisers and 10 cruisers, with a couple added in early 1915, and 27 destroyers of 8 different classes. The k.u.k. Kriegsmarine could also count on 79 torpedo boats, which were almost evenly split between high seas and coastal boats. As for submarines, the dual monarchy's navy had 7 submersibles, of which 2 were of the U-1 class, 2 of the U-3 class, and 3 of the U-5 class. The Navy also had torpedo cruisers of the Zara class, of which 4 were used as school ships, as well as a number of coastal battery guard ships of 5 different classes. It also had 6 river monitors, a mine layer, and a depot ship dating back to 1890. It's a little-known fact, but the very first shots of the First World War were fired by the Austro-Hungarian river monitor, Bodrog. This occurred on July 28, 1914, when the river monitor fired at Serbian positions on the Sava River. It would be the beginning of the bloodiest war ever witnessed until then in human history. Somewhat ironically, the first shot of the war would be by one of the weaker navies of World War I. So, what did Austria-Hungary do to try and strengthen its navy in World War I? During the war, shipbuilding projects would be fairly limited, albeit still quite ambitious. However, it was very much a case of what could have been, because many of the projects or parts thereof were never completed. Most impressive of all would have been 4 new dreadnoughts of the Tegetthoff class, which commenced construction in 1914, and were set for final completion in 1917-19. They would be capable of displacing 24,000 tons and would be armed with 10 350mm cannons. However, only one of these was ever completed. 3 light cruisers of the Zenta class were also put on hold between 1914 and 1915, with 4 destroyers of the Ersatz Tatra class suffering the same fate in 1917. More notably, a number of submarines or U-booties was also slated to be added to the fleet. Exact data on these is quite contradictory online, unfortunately. From what we can reliably ascertain from our research, submarine projects should have included 4 U-50 subs akin to the German U-48 U-boat, as well as 4 Type U-52, 8 Type U-101, and no less than 34 U-107 class U-boats. Most of these submarine builds did commence construction but were abandoned at various stages. For example, the U-50s were 90% complete by the end of the war. Even 6 LM-type submarines sent via rail by Germany never reached Pola before the war ended. When war broke out, the entire fleet was ordered back to the main base at Pola. The first mission of Imperial vessels was to escort German naval forces in the region. The principal mission of the k.u.k. Kriegsmarine thereafter was to stay put in Pola and protect the Adriatic Sea, over which Austria-Hungary had control. There was a single-mindedness by the Austro-Hungarians about this strategy. So, even when requests were made for the Navy to assist in raids against Allied forces in the Dardanelles in order to help the Ottomans, they were ignored. It was all about safeguarding the Adriatic and the Continental Empire beyond it. However, things got far more complicated for the dual monarchy when war broke out with Italy in May 23 of 1915. Italy had always been the biggest enemy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so Italy finally declared war on the double monarchy at midnight on May 23, 1915. At dawn on the very next day, the 24th, the Austro-Hungarian fleet bombarded the coastal rail line right down the length of Italy, from Porto Corsini in the north to Barletta in the south. 9 Austro-Hungarian battleships pounded the port of Ancona from 03:45 to 05:10, in which 5 merchant ships were hit. The attack was hardly like Pearl Harbor in scale or impact, but the Naval High Command back in Vienna was still thrilled. In retaliation, the Italians and their Entente allies bombarded the Dalmatian coast and offshore islands in the spring and summer of 1915, but it didn't make much difference because the k.u.k. Kriegsmarine was able to handily fight back. On July 6, 1915, the Austro-Hungarian submarine U-26 sank the Amalfi, an Italian armored cruiser off the coast of Venice. Another submarine, U-4, damaged the British light cruiser Dublin on June 9, 1915, and would sink the Italian armored cruiser Garibaldi 9 days later on July 18. The Italian campaign included a series of raids against Italian shipping by U-boots, destroyers, and torpedo boats, many of which were quite successful. Italy was not the Navy's only enemy, of course. The k.u.k. Kriegsmarine also made use of various river monitors on the River Danube in multiple offensives against Serbia. Austria-Hungary also relied on another new tactic in its raids: the use of naval aviation. This had been developed by Austria-Hungary in the 1910s, making it a pioneer in the use of aircraft for naval operations. Its aircraft were able to, taking advantage of weather conditions in the Adriatic, which were often mild and clear. A total of 570 aircraft were used by naval operations during World War I, which included bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft. Thanks to being pioneers in naval aviation, Austria-Hungary was also the first to invent the locomotive torpedo, as well as the first to have naval gunfire directed by aircraft. It was also the first navy to sink an enemy warship with the use of aircraft. That feat occurred in September 1916, when a pair of Austro-Hungarian seaplanes bombed the French submarine Foucault. The French submarine lost power and was unable to dive. The crew were forced to scuttle her. Although it had a modest navy, Austria-Hungary had insisted on a dedicated submarine program from the very outset of World War I. Their submarines were smaller and had less endurance than Germany's submarines, which is why German submarines took charge of patrolling the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, Germany had loaned 3 of its larger submarines to Austria-Hungary. These submarines, together with their existing submarine fleet, ensured that Austria-Hungary was a formidable bulwark in the Adriatic Sea. Austria-Hungary's first taste of success with her submarines came on December 21, 1912, when its submarine U-12 torpedoed France's flagship and its most powerful battleship, the Jean Bart. It was the first time that a modern dreadnought had been struck by a submarine torpedo when at sea. The stricken Jean Bart was able to limp back to Malta, but the French would never again send its battleships into the Adriatic Sea for the rest of the war. The Austro-Hungarian Naval High Command was delighted, relishing their investment in submarines. Austrian-Hungarian submarines were so effective that the British Royal Navy was forced to support the other Allied Entente navies in their anti-submarine patrols at the entrance to the Adriatic. They also had to contend with a series of minefields across the mouth to the Adriatic, which was known as the Otranto Barrage. All of this was a serious strain on the Royal Navy, which was stretched along various fronts and which had not invested as heavily in submarines before the war. Austro-Hungarian submarines proved very adept at targeting Entente merchant ships trying to get across the Adriatic. Their submarines also made successful short-distance forays into the Mediterranean as well. Throughout the Great War, Austria-Hungary would maintain its reputation as a leading submarine power, surpassed only by the might of Imperial Germany's groundbreaking U-boats. Austro-Hungarian submarine officers would be among the most respected submarine aces at the time. Among them was the commander of the Austro-Hungarian submarine, U-5, a certain Georg Ritter von Trapp. Von Trapp was a brilliant submarine commander. His small sub torpedoed and sank the French armored cruiser Léon Gambetta in April 1915 and went on to sink 13 other vessels. This was all the more remarkable since the submarine could only carry 4 torpedoes at a time and was a slow vessel, attaining a top speed of just 11 knots, or 16.5 miles per hour. Von Trapp would go on to command U-14, which had formerly been the French submarine, the Curie. The French sub had been captured by the Austro-Hungarians when it tried to infiltrate the large naval base at Pola. He and his subs alone accounted for the sinking of 61,328 tons of shipping. Von Trapp and his large family would of course gain international fame when their story was made into a musical and became the hit movie of 1965, The Sound of Music. He would forever be hugely proud of his career as the commander of 2 Austro-Hungarian submarines, one of which happened to be French. Even with its remarkable successes, particularly with its submarines and naval aviation division, the Austro-Hungarian Navy could not prevent the inevitable decline and crushing loss of its empire. By the close of 1916, and what had been nearly 30 months of war, the Austro-Hungarians had lost 2 old cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 4 submarines. This was far less than the Entente powers had lost in the Adriatic and Mediterranean region. Although a relatively modest and quite stunted navy, the k.u.k. Kriegsmarine was still able to inflict some damage against enemy ships. This included the sinking of 3 Italian battleships, 2 Italian cruisers, and a French cruiser between August 1914 and February 1917, with a total tonnage of 85,000 tons. In contrast, the Austro-Hungarians only lost 1 cruiser of 2,300 tons during the same period. Yet all of this wasn't enough. By 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was disintegrating, and the Imperial Navy reflected that. There were a number of defections by sailors and naval airmen from minority nationalities, including those of Italian and Croatian origin. At the naval base in Pola, there was a mutiny by 800 sailors who were fired up by the Bolshevik Revolution unfolding in Russia. That mutiny almost succeeded with red flags, almost raised on 3 warships. The mutiny was quashed, and the men rounded up by officers loyal to the emperor, and all of them executed. But the writing was well on the wall for Empire and Navy alike. And then on November 3, 1918, Austria-Hungary signed the armistice and surrendered. Just like that, the dual monarchy and empire was finished. For the Austro-Hungarian Navy, or k.u.k. Kriegsmarine, it was all over. By the end of 1918, Austria-Hungary had joined 3 other empires, those of Russia, Germany, the Ottomans, and collapsed. Even so, and as modest as it was, the Austro-Hungarian Navy certainly left behind a legacy that was fascinating and one to be proud of.